Thuringia, the home of Martin Luther and Johann Sebastian Bach. The Wartburg, symbol of Thuringia. Symbol of one of the most eventful eras in European and especially German history. Bach's ancestors can be traced back to the time of the Reformation in Thuringia. In 1517, about 200 years before Bach's birth, Luther nailed his 95 points to the door of the Schlosskirche in Wittenberg. In 1521, under the emperor's ban, he took refuge from his persecutors in the Wartburg, where he spent 2 years disguised as Junker Jörg. It was in this room that he began his translation of the Bible, which was to be the foundation of the modern German language.
These German and wonderful writings of the late Dr. Martin Luther.
That is Bach's receipt in his own hand of the purchase of a number of volumes, which, already an old man, he added to his library of Luther's works. Something like a third of the theological works that he left were either by Luther himself or by one of his commentators. 21 thick folio volumes. The spirit of Luther is everywhere in Bach's life and Bach's music. The only Bach portrait universally accepted as genuine by scholars. Bach commissioned it himself. It shows him at the age of 61. In the family chronicle that he put together, Bach tells us about his ancestors. It is preserved in a copy made by his granddaughter.
Origin of the musical family of the Bachs. Number 1, Vitus Bach, a baker in Hungary, was obliged in the 16th century to leave Hungary on account of the Lutheran religion, and hence made his way to Germany, where he found in Thuringia sufficient security for the Lutheran religion. He settled in Weimar, near Gotha, and continued to work as a baker. His greatest pleasure was his cittern, which he took with him to the mill and played while he ground the corn.
Some 70 of the descendants of that lute-playing baker earned their livings as musicians. More than 60 of them established themselves here in central Germany. Bach's had for generations played a leading role in the musical life of Thuringia, when, on March the 21st, 1685, the greatest member of the family was born at Eisenach. Bach's uncle, Johann Christoph, was town organist here and court harpsichordist. He is the most distinguished of the composers among Bach's ancestors, and as a boy, Bach often heard him play. Another uncle who composed was Johann Michael Bach, clerk and organist in the small neighboring town of Geren. He was to become Johann Sebastian's father-in-law. This was his greeting of one New Year's Day in the 17th century.
Sei lieber Tag willkommen, sei lieber Tag willkommen, willkommen sei du heut. Freuen sich die Frommen, die als Zeiten großen Nacht dort ihren Stamm verloben. In Loben hoch erhoben,
Once a year, there was a large family gathering of the Bachs, generally here in Erfurt. On these occasions, they sang and made music together and exchanged family and professional news. Bachs were active in Erfurt and the neighborhood as choirmasters, organists, town and court musicians. Johann Ambrosius, father of Johann Sebastian, he moved in 1671, 14 years before Johann Sebastian's birth, from Erfurt to Eisenach. Here he worked as musician to the town council. His wife, who was born Elizabeth Lamhert, came from a family of Thuringian artisans. For 123 years there were Bachs, relations of Johann Sebastian and their descendants, working as organists in Eisenach. The house in which Bach was born no longer exists. It probably looked like one of the better class houses that can still be seen in the old central part of Eisenach. One of these houses has been the Bach Memorial since 1910. Johann Sebastian grew up as a child in a house of this kind. No doubt in Bach's day, the room will not normally have looked quite as tidy and cheerful as that. Johann Sebastian's mother died when he was 9. A year later, he lost his father, too. At 10, he was an orphan. The oldest of his 3 brothers was organist in the little town of Ohrdruf, and he took in Johann Sebastian, who went to school and was given his first musical instruction here. As his brother's family grew, Johann Sebastian was sent to Lüneburg. He must learn to stand on his own feet. His good voice won him a place in the school attached to St. Michael's. He sang in the boys' choir, and later, when his voice broke, played the violin in the school orchestra. At Lüneburg, Bach got to know the most important works in the repertory of German church music. On several occasions, he journeyed to nearby Hamburg to hear the organist Jan Adam Reinken, famous for his powerful and interminable choral preludes. The free imperial and Hansa town of Hamburg was one of the great trade centers of the North Sea. It also enjoyed, chiefly thanks to its opera, a reputation as the leading town of Germany musically. At his castle of Celle, the Duke maintained a famous orchestra with mostly French players. And it was this orchestra that gave the young Bach his first experience of the French and Italian court music of the day. Having finished his schooling at Lüneburg, he was engaged as livery servant and violinist in the private orchestra of the co-reigning Duke Johann Ernst of Saxe-Weimar. After only a few months at Weimar, he moved on, having been appointed organist of the new church at Arnstadt. His work for the church took up 3 days of each week, and the rest of his time could be given up to his own musical pursuits. He spent 4 years in Arnstadt, from the age of 18 to 22. He was part of an almost 200-year-old tradition of Bachs working as musicians at Arnstadt. three great North German organ composers were particularly important in Bach's development. Johann Pachelbel held a post here at the Preacher's Church at Erfurt. His strict fugues were a protest against Italian composers who combined elements of both secular and sacred songs in their works. Georg Böhm was quite different. He was organist of the St. John's Church at Lüneburg, and his luxuriant coloraturas and paraphrases delighted Bach while he was still a schoolboy. Dietrich Buxtehude occupied a central position. His superb choral preludes range from the simplest melodies to the most intricate counterpoint. Bach used all these forms, improving on them and giving them new motivic vitality. In November 1705, Bach, now 20, was given 4 weeks' leave in order to hear Buxtehude at Lübeck. Dietrich Buxtehude was organist at the St. Mary's Church. He probably also gave the young Bach lessons. However that may be, Bach returned to Arnstadt having overstayed his leave by 3 months. He had to explain this to the church council. They complained not only that he'd overstayed his leave, but that his odd organ preludes upset the congregation. He also gave too little time to the school music, they said. Bach's violent treatment of one of the pupils had recently been brought to the notice of the council. Bach tried to defend himself against these accusations, but it becomes clear from these documents that Bach was never a born teacher, either as a young man or later in Leipzig. His difficulties with the church council dragged on for 9 months. Bach finally promised to give a written undertaking that he would in future fulfill his duties. It seems from the documents as though this undertaking was never in fact delivered. At the age of 22, he received an invitation to play the organ in the free Thuringian imperial town of Mülhausen. The organist there had recently died, and in the summer of that year, Bach was appointed to succeed him at the Church of St. Blaise. His salary consisted of 85 gulden a year, 3 measures of wheat, 2 cords of wood, 6 bundles of faggots, and 3 pounds of fish, an average wage for those days. The town council had paid his predecessor less, although he held the post for 30 years. Bach's skill in money matters was already clear at Mülhausen, and also the respect with which he was always treated by his employers. The choirmaster's house at Geren. Here lived the 4 daughters of Johann Sebastian's uncle, Johann Michael Bach. The young man spent much of his time here, and not simply because he was a relation. On October the 17th, 1707, he married the youngest of his 4 cousins, Maria Barbara, at Donheim. A few months later, he composed the cantata God is My King in honor of the newly elected town council of Mülhausen. 2 weeks before Bach started work in Mülhausen, the most prosperous part of the town was destroyed by fire. The citizens had other things than church music on their minds. Funds for it were low. Superintendent Frohner was well disposed, but neither this nor the friendly attitude of the local pastor, Almar, could keep the impatient young Bach at Mülhausen for long. After no more than 12 months, he sent in his resignation. In it, he complained first of the poor circumstances of church music in Mülhausen, and then of his own low salary.
God has granted me an unexpected change, from which I can hope for a more sufficient competence and the achievement of my chief purpose, which is the furthering of church music without further vexation.
In 1708, Bach returned to Weimar as court organist and chamber musician to the reigning Duke Wilhelm Ernst, for whose brother he'd already worked. The Duke is believed to be one of the most artistically inclined rulers of the day. His court orchestra numbered some 20 players. Some of these served also as huntsmen, cooks, or livery servants, as was the custom of the day. Whether Bach too was obliged, in addition to his musical duties, to wear livery, we do not know. His salary in Weimar was twice as much as it had been in Mülhausen, and rose to 3 times as much during his first 5 years. In 1714, when he was 29, he was promoted to Concertmeister, and this meant another rise in his salary. The Duke seems to have valued Bach's accomplishments highly. The castle chapel, destroyed by fire in 1774, the scene of Bach's main activities. During his 9 years at Weimar, he wrote a great many of his organ works. parish church of Weimar. The organist was Gottfried Voltaire, who was also the author of the first German musical lexicon, still one of our best sources of information about the music and musicians of the day. Voltaire and Bach were cousins. At Weimar, they became close friends, each influencing the other. From 1714 onwards, Bach had also to compose the cantatas for the chapel services. Thus, the last 3 years at Weimar saw the creation of a large number of vocal works that form an imperishable treasure house of Christian church music. Bach was 23 years old when he went to Weimar and 32 when he left it. During these years, he met many of the musicians of the day, made contacts with princely families in the neighborhood, and visited towns in the vicinity. 6 of his children were born at Weimar, including Wilhelm Friedemann and Carl Philipp Emanuel. He established his reputation as a virtuoso organist and was increasingly admired as a composer, although his contemporaries had as little idea as he himself of the future significance of his music. In 1717 came the break with the Duke of Saxe-Weimar. The court Kapellmeister Johann Samuel Dreser died at a great age. The Duke wished him to be succeeded by the most famous musician of the day, Georg Philipp Telemann, who held a post in Frankfurt am Main. When Telemann declined, the Duke appointed Dreser's son, an undistinguished musician who had often taken his old father's place and was now to succeed him. Bach felt that he had been passed over and was deeply offended. He now tried to leave Weimar as soon as possible. When Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Köthen offered him a post as court Kapellmeister, he immediately accepted, although in Köthen he would have no responsibility for church music. The Köthen court was Calvinist, and music there was a matter of princely prestige and social entertainment. The tone of Bach's letter of resignation displeased the Duke of Saxe-Weimar so greatly that he had him imprisoned on account of his obstinate insistence, the official reason for Bach's arrest, from November the 6th to December the 2nd, 1717. Rivalries between the two courts undoubtedly played a part in the matter. Bach entered on his new duties at Christmas 1717. He was now in charge of the chamber music at a small court where the arts were appreciated. Johann Sebastian Bach as court Kapellmeister at Köthen. Bach's 6 years at Köthen were professionally the happiest years of his life. He was now in his middle 30s. Prince Leopold was just 23 when Bach entered his service, and he was one of the violinists in his own court orchestra. He was proud of his new Kapellmeister, whom he took with him when he traveled. The relationship between the two young men was a friendly one and did not cease when Bach left Köthen. A number of Bach's compositions were dedicated to the prince and his family, both now and later when he had left Köthen. Years later, Bach was to remember,
There I had a gracious prince, both a lover and a connoisseur of music, and one with whom I had thought to spend the rest of my days.
In July 1720, Bach returned from a journey with the prince to Carlsbad to find his wife dead. Three of the 7 children born to Maria Barbara Bach had died. Of the remaining 4, the eldest, a daughter, was 12, Friedemann 10, Philip Emanuel 6, and the youngest, a boy, 5 years old. 18 months later, Bach married again, Anna Magdalena Wilke, the daughter of a trumpeter in the Weissenfels court orchestra. She was not only an affectionate wife to him and a patient stepmother to his 4 children. Although no more than 21, she brought to her marriage with Court Kapellmeister Bach a deep understanding of music. The marriage registered the court chapel at Köthen, the official entry of the marriage. Anna Magdalena was an accomplished singer. Contemporaries praised her beautiful soprano voice. In both the still existing Klavierbüchlein, we can see Bach instructing his young wife musically and explaining to her his artistic aims. The second of the 2 Klavierbüchlein.
Some very necessary rules concerning general bass.
A title page of Johann Sebastian's for a musical manuscript of Anna Magdalena's. In addition to her many duties as a mother and a housewife, she helped her husband with music copying. Some of Bach's finest works are preserved only in copies made by her. Bach's music script, a violin sonata. In the course of time, Anna Magdalena's music script came to resemble her husband so closely that her copies were long believed to be in Johann Sebastian's own hand. Her copy of the same sonata, and Bach's original again. Anna Magdalena shared the musical education of their large family with her husband. In addition to the 4 children of his first marriage, she bore him 13, 7 of whom died. 6 outlived their father. Without Anna Magdalena's powerful personality and practical assistance, and the famous musical atmosphere of the Bach household, the enormous output of Bach's later years is unthinkable. On the left, Anna Magdalena's copy. On the right, Johann Sebastian's original. Bach's works mark the culmination of an era which still saw the artist as a spiritual artisan. Everything in his life seems normal. Religion, belief, love, family, everyday existence, and his indefatigable creative activity. Bach did not recognize his own genius. He neither concealed it from his contemporaries nor flaunted it, as so many later artists were to do. Our present idea of genius did not yet exist. His genius is inseparable from his craftsmanship. Bach's works belong to an age in which singing and music making was still a recognized part of everyday life, as familiar and taken as much for granted as television or driving a car today. Music meant what was written, played, and often improvised by contemporaries. It was not until 100 years later that people concerned themselves with the systematic study and performance of music of the past. Bach was 36 when he began to consider leaving Köthen. He had already written a large proportion of his total output: 36 cantatas, the 6 Brandenburg concertos, numerous sonatas, suites, and organ works. By the end of his 30s, the well-tempered clavier and other works written at Köthen had revealed his complete mastery of his art. Our pianist is playing on a modern grand piano tuned in the modern way, namely with all the semitones equal. In Bach's day, other tunings were preferred, in which all keys were not equally usable, but those that were practicable were each distinguished by a particular quality of tone. Bach developed a way of tuning that he called well-tempered. By his method, certain differences of tone, and thus of character, were preserved, though all keys were equally usable for the first time. In 1721, there occurred an event in Prince Leopold's life that did not at all suit court Kapellmeister Bach.
It came about that the aforesaid Serenissimo married a princess of the house of Barenburg, and it began to seem as though the musical inclinations of the said prince were to become somewhat tepid, since the new princess appeared to have no love for the muses.
Although Bach had been happy at Köthen, he became increasingly aware of the limited possibility that it offered in the professional field. He longed to get back to church music and to the organ. Köthen did not offer the right possibilities for the education of his growing family. He therefore applied for the vacant post of organist at St. James's Church in Hamburg. Although the electors were in full agreement over Bach's capabilities, they appointed a rival applicant, the reason being that he paid the required sum of 4,000 marks into the church funds, which Bach, with his large family, could not afford to do. Pastor Edmund Neumeister, a well-known poet who provided the texts for many of Bach's cantatas, made a bitter reference to this in his Christmas sermon. Even an angel who played divinely and wished to become an organist would have no luck at St. James's if he had no money. Leipzig. In the summer of 1722, the post of musical director of the main churches and choirmaster at St. Thomas's fell vacant. The town council's first choice was Telemann, who had had connections with Leipzig since his student days and was considered the foremost German composer of the day. Bach had been friendly with him since Weimar. Telemann was music director in Hamburg and simply used this Leipzig invitation to obtain a rise in his Hamburg salary. At this, the Leipzig council invited a pupil of the late choirmaster of St. Thomas's, also a well-known musician. He refused. Finally, Bach applied for the post, with some hesitation, as we can see from a letter written years later.
Although, at first, it did not seem to me fitting for a Kapellmeister to become a choirmaster, for which reason I did not take my resolve for a quarter of a year, yet this post was so favourably described to me that at last, and since my son seemed to incline to these self-same studies, I plucked up courage in the name of the Almighty and betook myself to Leipzig, passed my examination, and so undertook my change of status.
It is no reflection on the artistic understanding of the 36 town councillors that they first approached three older musicians well known in Leipzig. Bach had indeed a reputation as an organist and a court musician, but not yet as a composer of church cantatas. And unlike his predecessors, he had had no university training for his teaching post at St. Thomas's School. As test pieces to back his application, Bach composed 2 church cantatas. In view of these, he was preferred to all other applicants and unanimously elected as choirmaster at St. Thomas's. The test cantata, Jesus Called to Him the 12, had its first performance here at St. Thomas's on February the 7th, 1723. That is Leipzig about 1723, a walled town with some 25,000 inhabitants. One of the important commercial centres of Europe in those days, by today's standards, a small town. The following appeared in the local newspaper for May the 22nd. At noon last Saturday, 4 carts laden with domestic furniture arrived here from Köthen, the belongings of the Prince of Köthen's Kapellmeister, who has been appointed choirmaster in Leipzig. At 2 o'clock, he himself arrived with his family in 2 coaches and moved into the newly decorated apartments at St. Thomas's School. The town council's official deed of appointment contained 14 points. In these, Bach pledged himself,
1. To live an honourable and retiring life and set the boys a good example. 2. To bring the music in the main churches of this town into good repute. 3. To show all due respect and obedience to their excellencies the town councillors. 6. Diligently to instruct the boys not only in vocal but also in instrumental music. 7. So to ordain the music in the churches that it shall neither be too long nor operatic in effect, but shall rather encourage the hearers to religious devotion. 12. Not to absent myself from the town without the consent of the Lord Mayor.
This is the Bible on which Bach took his oath of office. When he was solemnly inducted into his new office on June the 1st, 1723, a dispute arose between the representatives of the town council and the church council. The town council representatives complained that the pastor of St. Thomas's, who also had the function of school inspector, had officially welcomed Bach, which should have been done by the town council, not the church council. The documents concerning this dispute. Tensions of this kind between the two bodies which Bach served could often prove favourable to his wish for independence. He exploited them, and even on occasions fomented them. In this letter, he gives us information about his income. It varied according to the number of weddings, funerals, and other occasions for which he had to produce music, in addition to his fixed salary as choirmaster. In 1729, the Leipzig climate was worrying him.
My present post brings in about 700 Reichsthaler, and if there are rather more deaths than usual, my occasional fees rise in proportion. But if the season is a healthy one, these fees diminish, as happened last year, when ordinary funerals brought in over 100 Reichsthaler less than usual.
Moreover, some well-to-do skinflints in Leipzig would have their children christened in a neighbouring village in order to save money on the music. Bach's fees, in fact. Leipzigers were no fools about money. The Elector of Saxony was also King of Poland. Through the Leipzig market, Saxon industrial goods were exported to Eastern Europe, and the raw materials and agricultural produce of Eastern Europe imported into Central Europe. Augustus's court in Dresden might spend extravagantly on the arts, but the citizens of Leipzig counted their money. St. Thomas's Church was not only, geographically speaking, close to the exchange and the town hall. A year after his arrival in Leipzig, Bach composed the St. John Passion, his first. The title page of the St. Matthew Passion. This was given its first performance 3 years later at St. Thomas's under Bach's own direction on Good Friday, 1727.
Von der 6. Stunde an war eine Finsternis über das ganze Land, bis zu der 9. Stunde. Und die 9. Stunde schrie Jesus sprach Etliche aber, die da stunden, da sie das hörten, sprachen sie: Wir hoffen den Elias. Und bald lief einer unter ihnen, nahm einen Schwamm und füllte ihn mit Essig und steckte ihn auf ein Rohr und tränkete ihn. Die andern aber sprachen: Halt, lass sehen, ob Elias komme und ihn treffe. Aber Jesus schrie abermal laut und verschied.
There were altogether 7 teachers on the staff of St. Thomas's School. The choir master was third in order of importance, coming after the headmaster and assistant headmaster. Bach taught 3 periods a day. At first, he taught Latin as well as vocal and instrumental music to the upper forms. But he soon handed over the teaching of Latin to a deputy, a colleague whom he paid to do the work. This is where the rehearsals took place for the Sunday cantata on the preceding Saturday afternoon. Every 4 weeks, it was the choir master's turn to supervise the boarders. Bach's superiors repeatedly complained of his neglecting his school duties.
An odd authority with little devotion to music,
as he calls them in a letter. The members of the town council certainly admired Bach's musical gifts, but in his view, they were too tight with the municipal purse when it came to spending money on music. This is what they looked like, the 6 mayors who held office during Bach's 27 years at St. Thomas's. There were plenty of disagreements, but there can be no doubt of Bach's efforts to come to terms with the Leipzig authorities, including some sly practice on his part, or of their readiness to get on well with their obstinate choirmaster. Bach was even on friendly terms with some of the councillors and their families. This can be seen from the names of his children's godparents, as well as from the commissions he received. He could maintain himself and his family very decently in Leipzig. His numerous children received an education suitable to their place in society. Living among these comfortably found burghers, the quondam court Kapellmeister van Köthen became the independent-minded burgher Johann Sebastian Bach. He was fond of good food, was no fool at figures, and knew the value of money. Despite the expense of a large family, he eventually achieved a modest affluence. The official list of his possessions. Sections 1 and 2 contain mining shares, cash, and showpieces, as valuable coins used to be called. Sections 3 and 4 contain promissory notes, and Section 5, silverware and other valuables. Bach's collection of 19 musical instruments is listed, and finally, domestic objects of all kinds in tin, copper, and brass. Sections 9 to 11 detail Bach's clothes and his linen, a by no means modest list. This is followed by the long catalogue of his religious books. Bach's total estate in material possessions would today be valued at about $20,000. When Bach came to Leipzig in 1723, St. Thomas's School was in a bad way. There were too few rooms, and those few were in bad condition. The headmaster, Johann Heinrich Ernesti, had for years neglected discipline and order. Playing and singing in the street could be a lucrative sideline for both schoolboys and teachers, but it ruined the voices of the choir. Bach's predecessor as choirmaster, Johann Kuhnau, had made repeated appeals to the council to stop this practice, but without success. Salomon Deiling as superintendent, Bach's superior in his ecclesiastical post. He was not exactly a zealous reformer. The choirmaster of St. Thomas's was officially responsible for all church music in Leipzig. But under Bach's predecessors, the new church, where Telemann had been director of music in 1707, had made itself virtually independent. The same was true of the university, where the church music had come under the influences fashionable in the early 18th century, especially that of the popular Italian opera. Bach's battle to reassert the authority of the choirmaster of St. Thomas's over the whole of church music in Leipzig was not merely personal. He was concerned above all else with his own musical opportunities. When he was unable to make his point with the Leipzigers, he finally appealed to the court in Dresden. Friedrich August I, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, known as Augustus the Strong, he eventually decreed that Bach's request was to be granted, and that the university was to pay him the annual fee of 12 thaler, which they had always paid the choirmaster of St. Thomas's before. Leipzig realized for the first time that their choirmaster had been a court Kapellmeister, who knew how to make good use of his influence in court circles. Bach fought, often grimly, for his rights and his reputation, but never lost sight of the final purpose of all his work.
In fine, the end and aim of all music, and therefore that of general bass also, must be nothing else but only God's glory, and the recreation of man's spirit. If this be not borne in mind, there can be no true music. I have had to be diligent. Anyone equally diligent will go as far.
That is said to be the answer Bach gave when he was asked how he had achieved his mastery of music. Beside composing his own music, Bach also made copies of many other composers' works for performance in Leipzig. He admired George Frederick Handel. When Handel came from London on a visit to his native town of Halle, Bach was ill, and this prevented the two greatest composers of the day from meeting personally. Johann Sebastian Bach's copy of the Passion by George Frederick Handel. Bach copied works by Palestrina and Girolamo Frescobaldi. He performed a number of Telemann cantatas in Leipzig, probably on several occasions. He arranged works by Antonio Caldara and many other leading composers of the day. This is the autograph of an unknown contemporary, and beneath it, Bach's copy of a cantata by Francesco Conti. Bach followed the free and easy practice of his day in his handling of performing material, no matter who the original composer might have been. He altered the text and the instrumentation, cut or double the length of the original to suit his own purpose. Bach's best-known adaptations today are his transcriptions of the violin concertos of Antonio Vivaldi, whose works became known in Germany in an edition that appeared in Amsterdam in 1711. Vivaldi's works had a great influence on Bach's orchestral music. In the course of his life, Bach's output covered every musical genre with the exception of opera. The richest section is composed of the sacred and secular cantatas. There are about 240 of these, of a quality never attained by any other composer. Apart from the 3 dozen that date from his Weimar days, they were all written in Leipzig. With these cantatas, Bach fulfilled his musical duties as they arose in the course of the ecclesiastical year, paid homage to the rulers of the day, or honored other special occasions. We can only guess the circumstances in which they were written. They were certainly not the so-called inspirations of genius, so much as urgent, everyday duties that had to be completed for the weekend rehearsal. The same is true of the passions, motets, and other works that belong to the Leipzig period. 40 years after Bach's death, in the spring of 1789, a young man passing through Leipzig went to play the organ at St. Thomas's. When his eye caught the autographed parts of Bach's motet, "Sing unto the Lord a new song," he looked them over carefully. This was a man from whom he could learn something, he said. His name was Mozart, and he was 33 years old. How was Bach's vocal music performed in his lifetime? Bach's arrangement of choirs in May 1729. There were 55 boys in St. Thomas's School, and they had to be divided into 4 choirs, one for each of the main churches, St. Nicholas and St. Thomas, and 2 for other churches in Leipzig.
In St. Peter's we have the trash, by which I mean those who have no understanding of music, but can simply sing a chorale at a pinch.
St. Nicholas was the parish church, and Sunday and feast day musical services alternated between here and St. Thomas's. St. Thomas's in Bach's day. The town council employed 8 professional musicians, 3 violinists, 1 apprentice, and 4 town pipers, as wind players used to be called. These, with a dozen students and pupils, made up the orchestra of 18 to 20 players. Illness often reduced the number of both singers and players. Bach's 2 main choirs can have consisted of at most 12 voices each. There were no soloists in the modern sense. The recitatives and arias were sung by members of the choir. Bach's great vocal works were first sung by boys. The Thomaner choir in Leipzig has continued this tradition till today. The numbers of the choir have, of course, tripled since Bach's time, and solos are now sung by professional singers. The present choirmaster. This is how we must imagine conducting in Bach's time. Or else the conductor kept singers and players together from the harpsichord or with his violin. In this autograph, Bach shows the place occupied by the music and the cantatas in the service.
Order of service in Leipzig on the first Sunday of Advent, morning.
In accordance with the ecclesiastical year, Bach had to perform altogether 59 cantatas, including feast days as well as Sundays. Each lasted on an average 20 minutes. He may well have written 300 church cantatas during his life. About 200 of these have come down to us. The first practical complete edition was not made until the tercentenary of Bach's birth and was combined with the first complete recording. A mountain of more than 200 volumes of music and texts and 100 long-playing records. It had been 15 years' work to produce these, and no one knows how much preliminary work on the part of Bach's scholars. Nothing gives a clear idea of the sheer quantity of Bach's output. This first complete recording has been made by the choirmaster Helmut Rilling.
Thank you.
University of Leipzig in Bach's day. In 1729, when he was 44, he took over the direction of the Collegium Musicum, which Telemann had founded. In this way, the students were at his disposition for his musical undertakings. A year later, Bach put a petition before the Leipzig Town Council.
Short but most necessary draft for a well-appointed church music, with certain modest reflections on the decline of the same.
He analyzes existing conditions, points out abuses, and suggests ways of correcting them. He compares the necessitous position of musicians in Leipzig with their generous support at the court of Dresden. He charges the council indirectly with penny-pinching and meanness.
In conclusion, I find myself obliged to leave for maturer consideration whether in these circumstances music can be maintained or whether its further decline is to be feared.
Bach's predecessors had always signed petitions, "Your most noble and discreet honours, very humble and obedient servant, choir master at the school of St. Thomas." Not so Bach, who signed himself
Director Musices.
The Leipzig Town Council did not answer this petition. When the money from the various legacies and foundations was apportioned that year, the assistant headmaster of St. Thomas received 130 thaler and another master 100. Bach received nothing. He complained in a letter to an old schoolmate, who was now Imperial Russian Court Councillor in Danzig, that he
must live amidst almost continual vexation, envy, and persecution. Accordingly, I shall be forced, with God's help, to seek my fortune elsewhere.
This bid for help was unavailing. Bach remained in Leipzig. That same year, 1730, Johann Matthias Gesner was appointed headmaster of St. Thomas's School. He had been a friend and admirer of Bach's since Weimar days. He was an excellent organizer, and it was not long before conditions at the school improved. During Gesner's 4 years at the school, the building was enlarged. This is how it looked before 1902, when it was pulled down. Gesner persuaded the town council not to take the proposed steps against Bach. From 1732 onwards, he again received his share in the annual distribution of moneys. But he had no confidence of living in peace with the Leipzig authorities. He therefore turned to the court at Dresden. As a previous court Kapellmeister of Anhalt Köthen, he hoped for the favor of the Elector of Saxony. He requested the title of court composer, which would impress Leipzig and strengthen his position. The then elector was Friedrich August II, the son of Augustus the Strong.
To your Royal Highness, I submit in deepest devotion the present slight labour of that knowledge which I have achieved in music, with the most holy, submissive prayer that your Highness will look upon it favourably, according to your Highness' world-renowned clemency, and not according to the poor composition, and thus deign to take me under your most mighty protection.
He adds to the petition, along with the flattery and his complaints of not being properly appreciated in Leipzig, the Kyrie and the Gloria of the B minor Mass. But the king had other worries. War kept him away in Poland for 2 years. When he finally returned to Dresden and Bach repeated his request, the king named him composer to the Royal Orchestra in Dresden. The appointment came at the right moment, for Johann Matthias Gesner had in the meantime left Leipzig. His successor, who had hitherto been the assistant headmaster, was called Ernesti, like the headmaster who had died in 1729. He was at first a friend of Bach's, standing godfather to 2 of his sons. But the 2 men were alienated before long, and finally became bitter enemies. The occasion of the quarrel was trivial, a dispute about a prefect. Bach and Ernesti took turns in bombarding the town council with complaints in writing. On the evidence of these, the fault cannot be said to lie with the headmaster. Bach's complaints show his irritable nature and his inability to see his superior's point of view. The wretched quarrel lasted for more than 2 years. Bach eventually turned to the king for help. Friedrich August II and his wife Maria Josepha spent Easter 1738 in Leipzig. After their visit, which Bach celebrated with a festive evening concert, the official hostilities between the headmaster and the choirmaster of St. Thomas's came to a sudden end. It was probably on the king's order. Bach, having celebrated the royal name day, not perhaps in vain, in a cantata.
Long live the king.
Between the headmaster and the choirmaster of St. Thomas's remained, and its effect was felt among Leipzig families. It clouded Bach's work at the school for the rest of his life. Both the teaching staff and the boys were now divided between supporters of the headmaster or the choirmaster, according to musical and personal preferences. The town councillors now avoided conflicts with their choirmaster, who was also a court composer. Bach himself wanted a quiet life. He grew older and more lonely. Of course, he had always had this peace at home, and despite occasional difficulties with his sons, his children brought him great happiness.
Altogether, they are born musicians, and I can assure you that I can put on a concert with my family, singing and playing, particularly as my present wife has a pretty soprano, and my eldest daughter joins in not at all badly.
Of his 20 children, 9 were still living when he died. 4 daughters and 5 sons, all musicians like their father, and 4 of them eventually well-known composers. Wilhelm Friedemann, a wonderful improviser at the organ and composer of innovatory keyboard sonatas. A character flaw eventually prevented him from developing his talents to the full. Carl Philipp Emanuel, harpsichordist to Frederick the Great. He accompanied his master's flute concertos at Sanssouci. He was later director of music in Hamburg. Johann Christoph Friedrich, leader of the court orchestra at the Buckeberg residence. Johann Christian, Bach's youngest son. For 2 decades, his fame put all other bearers of the Bach name into the shade. Padre Martini, the most important Italian musical theorist and Mozart's mentor, taught him and furthered his advancement. After a very successful career as an operatic composer in Italy, he became music master to the Queen of England in London and married a celebrated Italian opera singer. This picture was discovered recently. It is said to show Bach with 3 of his sons. The authenticity of the picture is questionable. So far, paint analysis has only established that it was painted about 1730. But 2 generations of Bachs could, in fact, have looked like this. After about 1740, Bach withdrew more and more from public musical life. He was in his mid-50s, and his powers were beginning to decline. Social developments passed him by. A new aristocratic upper-middle-class era was beginning. The Enlightenment was about to penetrate into central Germany. Bach enjoyed unusually good health all his life, but he had been short-sighted since he grew up, and he now became increasingly blind. Even so, he went on working with the same industriousness, revising early works and writing new ones. In 1747, he once more left Leipzig to visit Potsdam with his son Friedemann. Philipp Emanuel arranged his meeting with Frederick II of Prussia, later known as Frederick the Great. The young king passed among his royal contemporaries for a musician and a poet. His summer palace of Sanssouci had just been solemnly opened. Frederick II received Bach as a friend. He showed him his large collection of musical instruments, and they made music together. 2 months later, Bach expressed his gratitude in his own way.
With deep respect and pleasure, I still remember the very special royal grace when some time ago, during my visit to Potsdam, Your Majesty was good enough to play me the theme for a fugue on the clavier, and at the same time graciously charged me to execute it in Your Majesty's most august presence. I noticed very soon, however, that owing to lack of the necessary preparation, the performance did not turn out as well as such an excellent theme demanded. I resolved, therefore, and promptly pledged myself to work out this truly royal theme more fully, and then publish it to the world.
This was the origin of the famous work of Bach's old age, the Musical Offering, based on a theme of Frederick the Great's. Johann Sebastian Bach was 62 years old when he met the King of Prussia in May 1747. According to contemporary accounts, he was professionally proud, at times even overbearing, but in private life, a modest man and a good neighbor.
S.D.G. Soli Deo Gloria. To God alone be the glory. J.J. Jesu Juva. Jesus help.
These letters stand at the beginning and the end of many of Bach's scores. And yet he was by no means bigoted. His religion did not exclude cheerfulness or jokes. He was a devout Lutheran and shared the great reformer's unsqueamish enjoyment of earthly life. Moments of purely secular happiness, of cheerful high spirits indeed, alternated throughout his life with an almost mystical longing for death and redemption. We find this recurring all through the cantatas.
Come, sweet death, dearest God, when shall I die? Come, thou lovely hour of dying.
These titles are found among the cantatas. Bach believed in a new, redeemed life after death. The promise of this reconciled him to life's conflicts and woes. If, in fact, anything about his music can be explained, it must be on the basis of this mystical attitude towards both life and death. In the last resort, even the wealth of his formal inventions baffles intellectual analysis. For the mystic, spirit and form are identical. The musical subject undergoes a process of abstraction. Even at the end of the 20th century, with the proclamation of formal abstraction, total determination, and so forth, Bach still remains the most modern composer in the history of music. Nowhere is this clearer than in his Art of Fugue. Carl Philipp Emanuel added these words to the last page of music in Bach's hand. Nota bene. It was working on this fugue, in which the name B-A-C-H appears in the counter-subject, that the composer died. The Art of Fugue consists of 14 individual fugues and 4 canons, all on the same theme. Every imaginable type of fugue is represented, all using the same subject. A technical feat of composition in which one would have thought any natural flow of musical ideas must be stifled by the demands of academic theory. But no, Bach's genius shows itself so clearly in his ability to invent combinations and in the inexhaustible wealth of his ideas that the listener forgets all the theoretical side of the powerful fugal framework and hears the music as something entirely natural. Johann Sebastian Bach died on July the 28th, 1750, at 8 o'clock in the evening. He was in his 66th year and almost totally blind after 2 unsuccessful operations. The Art of Fugue appeared not long after his death. Since it found no buyers, Carl Philipp Emanuel had the title page of the printed edition changed and added a recommendation from an admired theorist of the day. But it served no purpose. And 6 years after Bach's death, only 30 copies had been sold, not covering even the cost of printing. Carl Philipp Emanuel was therefore obliged, eventually, to sell the plates on which the Art of Fugue was engraved. When her husband died, Anna Magdalena was 49 years old. She died 10 years later. A part of Bach's work has disappeared forever. The many hundred works that remain point into the future. The B minor Mass ends with the words, Dona nobis pacem. Give us peace.